child abuse genetic? I want to answer a question that comes up when we talk about generational trauma, and that is abuse genetic? So, if somebody was abused by their parent and those parents were abused by their parents, then we're basically looking at something that gets inherited from one generation to the next, right? No, that's actually not true. It is called generational trauma, but it's not necessarily something inherited. So, here's something that is important to understand: child abuse is not genetically predetermined. That's important. It's not like there is a child abuse gene that gets passed down and then activated somehow in future generations. But what researchers have found is intergenerational transmission of child maltreatment. That's what they call it. So, what that means is people who have been abused or neglected as kids have an increased risk of maltreatment toward their own children. The increased risk is real, but it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. There's so many different things coming into play when you're talking about this. So, here is an example of some research. There's a lot of research on this, so if you want to dig into that, you can. Sherry Madigan in 2019 with colleagues published a meta-analysis of 142 studies that studied more than 227, something like that. 227,000 parent-child relationships. And they found a modest association between experiencing childhood maltreatment and then it occurring in the next generation. There was another meta-analysis done. So what a meta-analysis is, for people who don't know what that is, when people do a meta-analysis, they dig into all of the research done on a topic during a certain period of time. So they take the topic, they look who's studied this between the years of this and this. Then they study those studies. Does that make sense? That's why it's called a meta-analysis. So anyway, Asink and colleagues looked at 84 studies, and they also found an increased risk of intergenerational maltreatment. So growing up with abuse does change the odds a little bit in the favor of it might happen in future generations. But here's where people sometimes misunderstand the science, because increasing the odds of something happening is not the same thing as causing something to happen. And it is definitely not the same thing as saying that something is inevitable to happen. It's not the same thing of excusing somebody's behavior. For example, I grew up in an extremely dysfunctional, abusive household. Okay? My father was a drug addict and an alcoholic. Generally, he wasn't an abusive person unless he was drunk, and it wasn't often. It was enough, but it wasn't very often. My mother, on the other hand, was very narcissistic. I would say undiagnosed bipolar disorder, perhaps, but definitely narcissistic personality disorder. And she was just cruel. Just cruel is almost like a game. There was no love, no affection, no kindness, no support, just nothing. My father was out of my life when I was 12 because of his drug habit. Now, would I be excused if I perpetuated that behavior, my mother's behavior, toward my own children? Like, would somebody just say, oh, but did you know how she was treated as a kid? It was so bad. Hell no! That does not excuse me whatsoever. Absolutely not. To me, it's a choice. Just because you have an increased risk of it does not mean you have to choose it. I remember how horrible it felt to be on the other side, to be on the receiving end of that abuse. There's no way in hell I would do that to my kids. Risk or not. Anyway, the vast majority, studies do show that the vast majority of people who grow up with abuse don't continue it. They don't perpetuate it. So that fact alone should change the way that we all talk about generational trauma, and that we shouldn't jump to the excuse of, oh, but they were really abused as kids, so yeah. No. If abuse were genetically programmed, if abused children were destined to become abusive parents, we wouldn't see so many people breaking the cycle. If you broke the cycle in your family, tell me in the comments, because I want to celebrate you, because it's hard. It's really hard. But there are people, hundreds of thousands of people who do break the cycle. But why does it repeat sometimes? There's a lot of reasons why it repeats. So imagine you grew up in a household where your father screamed at you anytime you made a mistake. You were humiliated, you were called names, you were punished harshly, perhaps you were beaten. You were taught that children obey adults without question. Nobody apologizes, nobody talks about their emotions, nobody teaches you how to regulate your feelings, nobody models healthy conflict. And then one day you become a parent yourself. What parenting model do you have stored inside of you? The one you grew up with. That's what's stored. Under stress, human beings can fall back on deeply learned patterns. So you might find yourself yelling at your kids. Maybe your child being defiant triggers something inside of you. Maybe normal childhood behavior, because kids press buttons, kids push limits. They want to see how much they can get away with. That behavior might feel extremely disrespectful to you because you were never allowed to behave that way. You were never allowed to express your emotions. You were never allowed to feel, let alone question your parents, right? So maybe your nervous system becomes overwhelmed really quickly, and you don't know how to calm yourself before you respond, and your response is abusive. So that's one way that trauma can travel through generations. But it's not because your DNA, like somewhere in your coils, it says, I must abuse my child, because I don't know any other way of parenting. But that's not true. What happened to you affected what you learned, what you experienced, how you regulate emotions, how you understand relationships, and what feels normal to you. But what about genetics? This is where I want to be extremely careful. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a geneticist. Okay? I just read a lot. I research a lot. And I'm a victim myself. And I know how to teach people. There is research that suggests genetic influences are associated with aspects of maltreatment risk. If one family study by Pittner and his colleagues, or her colleagues, I don't remember if it's a man or a woman, found evidence of genetic influence for perpetuating emotional abuse. But physical abuse and emotional neglect were primarily explained by environmental factors in the models that they studied. And other genetically informed research shows us that genes and environments can interact in complicated ways, things that aren't easy for us to explain. So those characteristics can interact with the environment that a person grows up with. But it is different from saying that child abuse is genetic, because heritability is not an inevitability. It's a good thing to remember. A genetic predisposition is not a command to your DNA to act a certain way. All right? None of this transfers responsibility for an adult's abusive behavior onto a child, i.e., it is not your fault that your mother was a psychopathic, narcissistic witch. It's not your fault. Nothing you did caused that. My mother would argue otherwise. She might even be watching this video and saying, oh my God, she was the worst child ever. no excuse for your abusive behavior. We all know that cycles can be broken. We know it. If you grew up with a father who was emotionally unavailable, my ex-husband, completely emotionally unavailable to our 4 children we had together. Totally did not show affection, love, barely showed appreciation for the kid, was not, heavy-handed with comments or anything like compliments, stuff like that. But my 2 sons who have their own children right now are wonderful fathers. Emotionally available, loving fathers. I'm so proud. If you're watching this, Andrew and Devin, I'm proud of you. One of my favorite pieces of research on this subject comes from Thornberry and colleagues. So they followed people over many, many, many years. They found that childhood maltreatment increased the likelihood of later maltreatment perpetuation, but they found something else that's important. Safe, stable, nurturing relationships mattered. Relationship satisfaction in the parenting role, attachment to your child, those were all associated with a reduced risk among adults who experienced childhood maltreatment in their childhood. It's not an entirely new discovery, okay? As far back as 1988, how many of you were alive in 1988? Wave your flag. Researchers Egeland, Jacobvitz, I'm reading this on my screen because I couldn't remember all their names, and Sroufe, Sroufe, they studied mothers who had been abused as children, but they broke the cycle. So what distinguished those mothers? They had experienced emotional support from a non-abusive adult in their life. They participated in therapy at some point in their lives because they wanted to have healthier, more stable, and supportive adult relationships. More recent research continues to identify protective factors and interventions that can help disrupt intergenerational maltreatment. Cycles can be interrupted. Cycle breakers, hey, okay? That brings me to accountability. I talk a lot about why people behave the way that they do, but understanding why is not the same thing as excusing. I see so many people responding on my social media saying things, oh, but I feel bad for them because of the way that their dad was or the way that their mom was. Maybe your father screamed at you and humiliated you because his father screamed at him and humiliated him. It may understand why you do it, but it doesn't make screaming at your kids something that is acceptable. Suppose your mother constantly criticized you. Mine did. I could never freaking do a damn thing right in her eyes. Okay? But maybe her mother criticized her. I don't think that was true, but I don't know for sure. Anyway, that history might explain my mother's behavior. It does not excuse my mother's behavior. Trauma deserves compassion, but children deserve protection. At some point, we adults all have to take the responsibility to examine what we inherited emotionally and behaviorally and decide what stops with us. Okay? If you saw my previous video about walking away from your family, and I ask you to say, tell me enough. Say enough. If you're sick of it, if you're a cycle breaker and it stops with you. Go find that video. It's really fun to see how many people say enough. So what this might mean for you, if enough is enough, it might mean you need to get into therapy. You might need parenting education to teach you what you should be doing instead of what your parents did to you. It might be learning how to emotionally regulate yourself so that your triggers don't send you into hitting your children, screaming at your children, criticizing your children, something like that. It might mean learning how to walk out of the room when you're feeling overwhelmed before you say stuff that you're going to regret or before you do stuff that you're going to regret. It definitely means repair with your children when you do something wrong. With my youngest kid right now, because I have 4 older kids and 1 much younger kid. If his father or I step over the line, we absolutely apologize. Tell him we are sorry. It wasn't okay what we did. We should have stopped and we should have taken a deep breath if we were calm or upset. We should have walked away instead of overreacting. So, repair is so important. You can repair even if your kids are adults. Repair. Repair what you did, or at least try. So, what this requires is parenting your children a different way than you were parented and making a concerted effort every single freaking day. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because you don't have a model. You don't know what healthy parents do. I'm actually creating a series on healthy parenting behaviors. So if you're curious, just do a search and find that series. I think I'll have 7 or 8 of videos. So having it be difficult is not the same as it's impossible. So to answer my first question, is child abuse genetic? Not in the sense that abusive destiny is written into somebody's DNA. Childhood maltreatment can increase intergenerational risk. We know that. Biology may contribute to some vulnerabilities, right, with our temperaments. Our environment matters, our learning matters, our relationships matter, trauma matters, but not one of those single things means I was abused, therefore I will abuse. Millions of survivors have proved otherwise. So if you came from an abusive family, I want you to remember something. You inherited an unfortunate history, but what you inherited is not your destiny as a parent. What happened to you was not your choice. As an adult, you can examine, and I encourage you to do that, examine what happened to you. Name it, heal it. You can learn what nobody showed you, what nobody taught you previously. And you can decide that the pain that traveled through your family stops with you. I'm Dr. Angela Solik, and this is the Still I Heal Project. Click the link in my bio to learn more.